And here we go. This episode is brought to you by sparrowfamilydesigns.com. You want to get high quality clothes? You want to get some real American threads and look good? And the barbecue, you want to turn your communist friend into a patriot? This is how you do it. Head on over to sparrowfamilydesigns.com. All right. Let's light this candle. All right, let's continue this very exciting series that I started and I kind of vomited a bunch of information out, but now let's begin this story. So, we're going to call this one sorry. We're going to call this Part 1, El Salvador in the Cold War. So, let's begin. El Salvador's history has revolved around its scarcest commodity, land. From the time the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century and throughout the turbulent decades of the late 20th century, rural land and agriculture lay at the core of the country's tumultuous and deeply inequitable social and economic history. El Salvador's searing legacy of unequal distribution can be linked back to the Spanish colonial system whereby land ownership was vested in the crown. The land, now known as modern El Salvador, was ruled before the Spanish conquest by an assortment of indigenous civilizations, including the Aztec and Maya. The local Pipil nation was active in the area at the time of the Spanish exploration in 1524. So, lacking precious metals and mineral resources, El Salvador was a backwater in Spain's colonial empire. Under the former administration of the Captaincy General of Guatemala during this time, local landowners held de facto sway along with the rest of Central America. In 1821, El Salvador declared its independence from Spain. It was initially incorporated into newly independent Mexico, then joined the United Province of Central America, a failed attempt to create a federal republic modeled on the United States. In 1841, El Salvador declared itself an independent country, the smallest country in Central America. El Salvador's early independence was marked by considerable political tumult. Filled with large plantations owned by a tiny elite, El Salvador's first key cash crop was indigo between the 1870s and 1930s. However, another export crop replaced the ebbing indigo: coffee. The new crop provided enormous profits that only served to reinforce the oligarchy's grip on the rural economy. The coffee industry grew more than 1,000% between 1880 and 1914, providing over half the government's revenue during these years. Most histories contend that the priorities of the coffee industry dedicated a shift in the mission of the embryonic armed forces from defense of the national territory to the maintenance of internal order. The formation of the National Guard, Guardia Nacional, GN, in 1912 epitomizes this revolution as it becomes responsible for providing security on the coffee states. In fact, most coffee plantations enjoy the services of their own guard units posted on the grounds. The state owners ensured the continual loyalty of the guardmen by routinely compensating regional commanders. In this sense, suppression of rural dissent was subtle and institutionalized. And if you guys have ever had Salvadorian coffee, oh my goodness, it is magnificent. You'd be like, you know what? I can see why the government did. I'm just kidding. So during the 1920s, a young Salvadorian intellectual from a wealthy family named Agustin Farabundo Martí Rodriguez, the namesake of the guerrillas who would take up arms decades later, worked tirelessly to organize Salvadoran workers, often wearing a red star on his lapel pin. The redoubtable Martin extended the ire of El Salvador's oligarchy and military, who saw him exactly as he was, a communist rabble-rouser. Martí was educated at the University of El Salvador, commonly called the National University, where he was deeply influenced by Karl Marx and other communist writers. He was an original member of the Central American Socialist Party, Partido Socialista Centroamericano, or the PSOCA, founded in Guatemala in 1925. Arrested repeatedly and ultimately exiled to Guatemala, the man known as El Negro for his dark complexion even spent some time in New York City, where he worked with anti-imperialism groups and met relatives of Nicaraguan freedom fighter Augusto Sandino, who later gained the fame fighting U.S. Marines in the mountains of his native country. Martí and Sandino apparently fell out over the later unwillingness to incorporate more Marxist elements into his nationalist crusade against the American occupation of Nicaragua. When Martí attempted to teach communism to Sandino, the Nicaraguan stopped him. And I quote, "If you think that you will seduce me with your ideas, do me a favor and don't stay here one more minute. I am not a communist." End quote. Martí's ethic in the name of the revolution was legendary. According to Salvadoran communist and Martí contemporary Miguel Marmol, Martí didn't know a... Sorry, here I'm quoting him. Martí didn't know a wife or children. His lover was the struggle. I knew him well. He was a practical man, dedicated, revolutionary man. I was right out here in the back of his house, gesturing toward a cemetery where they executed him. End quote. Dedicated Marxist ideologues such as Martí and Marmol would set a precedent for the future insurgency in El Salvador in the 1970s and 80s. While Marmol was never a key wartime guerrilla leader, he was nonetheless one of the revolution's initial ideological founders, a shoemaker, fisherman, union leader, and founding member of the Communist Party of El Salvador, Partido Comunista Salvadoreño, PCS. Marmol was born into poverty in 1905. By the age of 13, he became a soldier, but abuses by the military turned him into a leftist militant. Marmol recalled his ascetic life committed to revolution, and I quote, "I was leading strikes in February of 1921 when I was 16. Our youths were spent in the struggle. There were no sports for us, no movies, nothing but the progress of the movement." End quote. In a surprising democratic movement in 1931, a wealthy landowner with populist instincts, Arturo Araujo, ascended to the presidency as part of the Labor Party, Partido Laborista del Salvador, the PLES. Despite opposition from distrusting coffee growers. With coffee exports prices plunging as the Great Depression contagion reached Latin America, Araujo's popularity plummeted, and even his support from the impoverished rural farmers. In office only 9 months, Araujo was ousted by his sitting vice president, General Maximiliano Hernández Martínez, in a December 1931 coup. While personally drawn to the fascist models of Nazi Germany and Mussolini Italy, Martínez supported the Allied war effort during World War II, a move that won him favor in Washington. The conservative landowning class came to love him for his fervent anti-communism, but also looked askance as Martínez's humble origins and routine admonitions that poverty needed to be addressed so that communism would not flourish. In fact, contrary to his mano dura, or strong-armed or strong-hand historical legacy, Martínez promoted some modest social reforms, including a government welfare program. In addition to being a tyrant with a populist tinge, Martínez was also quite odd. He was nicknamed El Brujo, which means the witch or the witch doctor, for his belief in telepathy and reincarnation, and once remarked, and I quote, "It is a greater crime to kill an ant than a man, for when a man dies, he becomes reincarnated, while an ant dies forever." End quote. Despite Martínez's dubious beginnings, the military, FAES, effectively controlled the country for the next half-century until a revolution-like event occurred in 1979. Returning to El Salvador in the early 1930s, the revolutionary Marti's objective had moved from organization to revolt, which led to his first communist insurrection in the Western Hemisphere. Supporters contended that the PCS was formally established in 1930 in order to participate in the electoral system, but that the government's refusal to recognize his victories in January 1932, municipal and legislative elections prompted the shift to armed conflict. The deep discontent sparked by the plunge in coffee prices led a growing deep number of Salvadorians to embrace Marxist organizations like the PCS or the Anti-Imperialist League, Liga Antiimperialista de las Americas, or the, there's so many abbreviations here, LADLA. Martí lived in the mountains of western El Salvador, where he was able to rally El Salvador's multitude of impoverished farmers to rise up against the exploitive masters. The January 1932 revolt was in part fomented by a Communist Party militant attempting to take advantage of indigenous peasant unrest in the country's western provinces. It was also the first communist revolution in Latin America. Some scholars believe that the legacy of what came to be known as La Matanza, the massacre, was unrivaled over the next half-century. And I quote, "Indeed, the whole subsequent political labyrinth of El Salvador can be explained only in reference to the traumatic experience of the uprising and La Matanza," end quote. As it unfolded, peasants armed with machetes and rusty shotguns began to attack municipalities in the country's depression-plagued coffee-growing region. The rebellion did not gain much traction in San Salvador, as the communist leaders had been rounded up during the first hours of the uprising. With their operation lasting just a few days, the rebel controlled only scattered towns and provincial cities. In some instances, the poorly organized rebels took over villages, killing dozens of political opponents in the process. Having come to power just 6 weeks earlier in a coup, Martinez crushed the embryonic revolt by unleashing his military against the largely defenseless, mostly landless farmers who were even more vulnerable with the plunging coffee prices. Martinez ordered General José Tomás Calderón to lead. The repression not only lasted about a week, killing an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 Salvadorians. The inevitable task of burying the dead was left to local officials. Fearing future trouble that the Salvadorian leftists could cause, Hernández Martínez had Martí arrested and subsequently executed by a firing squad. In only 3 days, the rebellion had almost been entirely squashed. In the revolt's aftermath, the military promoted the creation of paramilitary militias, civic guards, Guardia Cívica, or the GC, that functioned like brotherhoods, and I'm holding finger quotes here, brotherhoods, holding fascist ceremonies and unleashing unrelenting terrors on the population. Communist conspirators were hunted down in San Salvador and elsewhere and executed in droves, leaving the Nansen party in tatters. A chilling thought from one of the La Matanza's proponents was captured the impetus of these events. Communism is a tree shaken by the wind. The moving tree causes the seeds to fall. The same wind carries the seed to other places. The seed falls in fertile soil. To be done with communism, it is necessary to make the ground sterile. Another saying attributed to the disturbing social calculus of that era was, "El muerto el perro sacaba la rabia," which translates to, "Kill the dog, kill the rabies." As part of the initiative to prevent future communist uprising in the aftermath of La Matanza, 18 rebellion leaders were put before firing squads. Mármol survived to tell the story. He recalled the bullets hitting his body and then lying still in his blood and another man's gore. The firing squad shot 7 times. The 4th shot got me in the chest, and the 7th got me in the head. I fell, but minutes later, I was still alive. The blood was in my mouth and made me want to cough." End quote. As some soldiers examined the bodies to kill the survivors, one of Mármol's dying companions shouted, "Long live the Communist Party!" Another shouted, "Death to General Hernández Martínez!" But Mármol remained quiet. His captors left Mármol for dead. but he lived on to be devil-strong military dictatorships for another 50 years. If it had not been for the clumsy firing squad, guys, learn to aim your rifles there, Marmo likely would have been just another forgotten victim of La Matanza. For Martinez and his fellow military officers, the lesson from La Matanza was simple: never again tolerate communism, agitation, or any other type of insurgency. Another outcome was that the Salvadorian military and oligarchy were inclined to see the peasant rebellion as a result of international communist conspiracy rather than a symptom of domestic poverty and desperation. This resulted in a tendency for rightist elements to label all form of social and political reforms as thinly veiled communism. So what is so hard to decipher is whether they knew this was not the case, but acted as they did to facilitate the desire to quell peaceful social reform in the country. Paradoxically, soon after the massacre, Embed Martinez wooed the masses, especially in the tumultuous western provinces, with promises of reform and protection from vengeful local elites. And after he was ousted for power in 1944, Martinez fled to Honduras, where 12 years later the former strongman was stabbed to death by his driver. And I quote, the son of one many thousands Salvadorians, Hernandez Martí has caused to be murdered, end quote. Martinez's downfall led other military leaders to take his place, officially under the military-dominated and far from Democratic Revolutionary Party of Democratic Unification, Partido Revolucionario de Unificación Democrática, or the PRUD. An electoral vehicle is used to legitimize its rule through presidential elections every 5 years. Contrary to the lasting stereotype that the military simply did the landed oligarchy's bidding during these years, these military regimes implemented both Martinez-style reform and repression. In 1960, though, reformist officers once again seized power and established a civilian military junta, which included Dr. Fabio Castillo, a strident supporter of the Cuban Revolution a year earlier. However, this democratic sprout did not last, as the junta was removed in counter-coup in 1962. The ruling military party became the National Conciliation Party, Partido de Conciliación Nacional, PCN, and ostensibly liberal anti-communist Colonel Julio Rivera was elected, deeply rattled by Cuba's stunning revolution and a perception that Havana was now exporting revolution in the hemisphere. That John F. Kennedy administration praised Rivera as a loyal ally in the fight against communist subversion. It was true, as was true of most of its Central American neighbors. El Salvador's stability, air quotes here, rested on a powerful alliance between the country's oligarchies and its military. Both of these groups feared another in 1932, like rural uprising that would lead to their demise. For that reason, they organized rural paramilitary groups, the most notorious of which was known as the National Democratic Organization, Organización Democrática Nacionalista, or ORDEN, which means Orden, which means order, created in 1962, known by the Spanish acronym for order. Orden relied on retired military officers and roughly 60,000 recruited conservative peasants as a pro-government military section civilian forces. Orden's primary purpose was to afford the government and a disciplined organization in the countryside that could, and I quote, teach the peasants the fundamentals of democracy, indoctrinate them against the dangers of communism, and provide social services and assistance to the poor. A 1979 classified U.S. State Department report indicates that many peasants joined the group because it protected them from arrest and allowed them to carry weapons, a sign of machismo. The presidential-run intelligence outfit Salvadorian National Security Agency, Agencia Nacional de Seguridad Salvadoreña, or ANESL, helped consolidate an era of military's hegemony in El Salvador. sowing terror selectively amongst alleged subversives identified by the intelligence services. Throughout both Orden and Anesal, the military's domination over civilian societies was consolidated through official and unofficial repression. An American diplomat active in the 1970s and 80s describes this dynamic, and I quote, "The right maintained control in rural areas as a local power structure developed. In many places that most resembled a gang of thugs, developed perhaps aided and paid by large landowners. These local enforcements were loosely organized on a national basis in something called Orden. These thugs brutalized any peasant who challenged them or the landowners. Sometimes the thugs were members of the local police, but in many cases they were a volunteer auxiliary police or military, usually with some link to the military, but not on any militarized organization chart. The main role of Orden at the national level appears to have been the various local Orden groups from fighting each other." End quote. Here is how the CIA explained the rural justice, the Salvadorian option era policymakers, in a 1985 report. "Control over society was handled by the military government and civilian elites, largely through paramilitary, constabulary forces, regular army units, and numerous officials and private vigilante organizations. The historical record shows that given the inherited weakness of the formal judicial process, these security bodies would often function at the local level as judge, jury, and executioner of individuals perceived to be the criminals or subversives." End quote. El Salvador's traditional security forces, as well as the Treasury Police, Policía de Hacienda, PH, and National Guard, enforced the law through repression and exclusion, in addition to their politicization that resulted in defending conservative policies. Insular agencies were simply not good at policing. That is, that they had very poor investigative training and lacked the most basic skills for protecting, recording, and using evidence. They also depended heavily on extrajudicial confessions extracted by torture and abuse to gain convictions. Part of El Salvador's social dilemma resulted from the demographic boom underway of the decades after World War II. The Massachusetts-sized country population in 1950 was 2 million and jumped to 3.5 million by 1970. A decade later, the country housed 4.5 million citizens, making it the most densely populated country in the Americas at that time. Neighboring Honduras increasingly served as a safety valve for El Salvador's exploding and largely impoverished population, a phenomenon that strained bilateral regulations. In 1969, after World Cup qualifying soccer matches in June, boiling tensions erupted in a war 2 weeks later. While the fighting only lasted 100 hours, it represented a victory for El Salvador, especially for the military officers who cast themselves as the heroes of the invasion. During the late 1950s and 60s, sustained economic growth that included light manufacturing helped spark urbanization and expand the size of the once pitiful small Salvadorian middle class, yet poverty, unemployment, and political disenfranchisement continue to tear at Salvadorian society. During the 1960s, new political organizations began to test El Salvador's long repressive political system, deeply influenced by the Catholic Church's powerful teachings on social justice. The Christian Democratic Party, Partido Demócrata Cristiano, PDC, emerged as a vocal advocate to reform. The 1972 presidential election proved to be a watershed as the Christian Democratic leader and former three-term San Salvador Mayor José Napoleón Duarte and his Democratic Socialist vice presidential running mate Guillermo Ungo campaigned on an umbrella ticket under the National Opposition Union, Unión Nacional Opositora, or UNO, like the game. Only it's not as fun. Against the military's handpicked PCN candidate, Colonel Arturo Molina. Interestingly, Duarte had entered politics because he was worried that the oligarchy's reactionary policies were making a communist revolt more likely, exactly what John F. Kennedy had feared. seeing how easily the Notre Dame University Duarte had taken the rural and urban votes. The military ordered a new blackout immediately after the polls had closed. 3 days later, the regime's official election board announced that Molina had in fact been elected president. Duarte described the fraud in a 1981 interview. And I quote, "We knew that the official party, the PCN, would try to cheat us, and they did. But they made a miscalculation. They had brought in polling experts, just like you have in the United States. The experts said that we would get about 200,000 votes, so they figured they're cheating on their basis. They thought 300,000 would give them a great victory, but we got 324,000, so they just took 9,000 away from us and gave it to themselves. When my people found out what happened, they gathered in the streets. One word from me, and they would have burned down the city. But I told them, I believe in democracy. I don't believe in turmoil or violent solutions. You must be patient." End quote. Implicated in an arbitrated coup by officers sympathetic to the cheated opposition, Duarte unwisely made a radio broadcast calling for support of an attempted pro-democracy coup in May 1972. Apparently, not an oxymoron in El Salvador in his dire moments that had failed. Duarte was quickly arrested and tortured. His face was severely broken before ending up in exile in Venezuela for the next 7 years. Colonel Armando Molina emerged as the victor from the 1972 vote and in fact implemented a mild land reform measured in 1973 and again in 1976 as a renewed push for industrialization that would lessen the country's chronic reliance on landed estate agriculture. Interesting, Molina also used orden to rally the rural peasantry in his favor. Yet Molina's successor, General Carlos Humberto Romero, would prove far more repressive. Romero's designation of the official military candidate in the rigged 1977 elections signaled the end of Molina's progressive programs. Romero's oppression earned him a bad reputation both locally and abroad, and he began to lose his grip on the power. He called for a national dialogue, and I'm quoting my fingers here, that could bring back democracy. But desperate attempts at mollification proved too little too late, as Romero antagonized both military elements and the increasingly mobilization left his opposition. In 1982, Duarte remarked a group of foreign correspondents who had arrived to cover national elections. "Where were you guys 10 years ago?" End quote. Indeed, one must wonder how differently El Salvador's history would have turned out if the reformist Duarte had been able to govern legitimately before the country turned into a bloodbath later in the 1970s. For many on the left, any possibility of peaceful reform ended with the 1972 fraudulent elections. Even if the event did not receive much attention outside of El Salvador, one future guerrilla leader quipped that, and I quote, "The dictatorship had shut the space for participation with the 1972 fraud," end quote. Another guerrilla stated a quarter century later that 1972, she concluded, and I quote, "Either we take the struggle into open on the mountains or they'll kill us here in the city," end quote. Oh, man, what a dark history, huh? We will continue this this series so you guys can figure out what happened, what led to this massive war. So remember, guys, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you.